entertainment.
Hello and welcome to Code Harvest. This is part 2 of the background slider tutorial where we demonstrate how you can create a pretty background slider design with HTML and CSS. In part 1 of the background slider tutorial, we focus on the logics of the background slider with JavaScript, so the link to part 1 is in the description down below. Subscribe to Code Harvest, and without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so now we can consider our slider working and it functions just like we wanted to. So now we're going to be focusing on the design of our slider, as right now it looks really bleak. So we're going to head over to our homepage main background slider section, and instead of text we're going to be displaying an image. We're going to be including another background in order to create, a purpley, darkish, slightly dark layout background over the image, so that the image kind of looks purpley, dark, but it shouldn't be as obvious basically. So the first thing that we're going to be including is our image. So we have included 3 images here. Our first one is a very nice munchy burger with some onion rings, tomato sauce on the side. Number 2, we have some crunchy fries, looks really good with some side dish. And number 3 is very nice, very dreamy looking fried chicken. The first image that we're going to be including is 01. However, this is stored in a folder under images called images, so we're going to be including the name of that folder and then the file name itself we want to access. And in case this image is not able, in case the browser or the page cannot be loaded, the page cannot load the image, then we want to include an alternative text. So L stands for alternative. So an alternative, instead of displaying this image, then it can display some simple text, and let's call this, it can be anything that we want it to be. So so this is basically our way of telling the user, or letting the user know of what image was supposed to be displayed. So we want it to be a little descriptive but not too descriptive. So we want to let the user know that it is a very HD quality image of a chicken veggie burger and side onion rings. So I think that's descriptive. That should be descriptive enough. For our slide 2, we're going to be including a different image, and this is stored as O2. So our descriptive text to our users is HD image of fries and side dish. And then slide 3 is going to be o3.jpg, and this is a plate of basically chicken wings, crunchy chicken wings. So we can go with HD image of crunchy chicken wings. Alright, so now first things first, we want to include our content. Our content will be the same. Only the image is different, but all of our content will be the same for each slide. So we're just going to copy and paste this. So the first thing that we want to include is the background layer that will basically overlap the image that will be in front of this image, and we want the image to look a little darker. This is too bright. We want it to be a little darker and just a little purple. So we're going to be including a div, and we're going to be including a class called darker slide, and this is where we'll be including all of our properties that will ensure that our image is darker and purpler. Then inside this dark slide, inside this background, we can include all of our contents, all of our text. So this div will be storing or holding up all of the slide's content, so we'll just call it slide content to make it simple. And then the first thing that we want to include is our heading, and we'll create a H1 standing for heading 1, and this will basically be the title which every user will see first. So we want it to look really big and we want it to be welcoming, so we will call this text Welcome to Munchies, the name of the company that we have created. The next thing we want to include is some descriptive text, a little description of what this company is all about basically. However, since this is just for demonstration's sake, we will include some lorem ipsum text to save us some time. So we'll go with lorem ipsum text, and we'll just click a random generator and select some random text. Alright, so you can see here we've just selected our lorem ipsum random text, and we've pasted it. We've layered it so that it doesn't overextend and we don't have to scroll over every time. And the last element that we're going to be including is our buttons, and we're going to be including 2 buttons, and they should be in one row. And because it's going to have a specific layout, we're going to first create a wrapper for this, and we're going to assign this to a class, and we'll call this button wrapper. And wrappers basically usually define hold elements just like a container, but they also define the layout that the elements will take. So we want the buttons, which are the elements in our case, to be in a row, which is not normal because usually elements are layered as a column by default. So we're going to be using display flex later on. So we're going to be including 2 buttons. The first button we will call button 1, and we'll include random text. We'll just say learn more. And then the next button, order now, and for this class it will be button 2. Alright, so right now we cannot see our content just yet, so it seems like our image has a higher positioning status. It has a higher Z index than our slide content, or than our darker slide div. So we're going to be changing this in our CSS file. So first let's copy all of this and let's create some spacing so our code looks more neat. We're going to copy all this and we're going to paste this in our other 2 slides. Now we'll be coming back to our HTML file later on in order to include our 3 little icons, and that will be at the end of this video. So first we'll be working on the design of our slides. So we're going to head over to our CSS file, and now that we're going to be working on the design, so we're done with demonstration, we can remove this temporary code, delete that. So right now, as you can see, the image is taking more space than it should. So basically, we've included overflow hidden to ensure that the image does not go over the boundaries of the slide element, which is set to width 100% and height 100%. The image is still overflowing. It is not resized to fit the slide element's boundaries. So we're going to resize this by selecting the image. So this image is part of the slide, so we'll select where the container of the image, or the parent element of the image, which is slide, and then the elements that we want to work on, which is the image itself, and we want to ensure that the width is set to 100% and the height of the image is set to 100%. So now that is much better, and it is resized to fit the boundaries of the slide element. And then another thing, to ensure that our image is clear, because at the moment it looks expanded, it looks a little bit like it has been stretched horizontally. We want it to be equal horizontally and vertically the way we got it, the way we saw it. So we're going to be using one more property called object fit, and we want the image to cover the whole slide, and it should still take up it should have a width of 100%, a height of 100%, and it should still properly cover the whole slide, the slide's dimension. So now that looks much better and it fits perfectly. Now the next element in our slide container, or our slide element, is the darker slide. So now we'll be working on the darker slide. So it is a class, so we're going to select it once again with a dot, and then we're going to include the name of the class we want to select and design, which is a darker slide. And first of all, since we're going to first work on the background color, and the background color should be dark and purple, just like we want it to be. So I found a good color combination. Now, in order for this darker slide should also be in front of this image, but then we don't want it to be fully dark. We don't want it to be fully opaque, since it will basically cover the image. We want it to be slightly transparent so that you can still see the image, but now you can see the image as a little darker and purple. So we're going to include these 3 values, RGB A. So usually it's just RGB, and then you include the 3 intensities in order to create the color combination that you want. But now this time we're including A alpha, which basically affects how transparent our background will be. So I found a good color combination of purple, which is 5961. So now the value of A, if it is set at 1, then that means it is not transparent. You are going to see this, you're going to see the background fully opaque. It's going to be fully opaque. But then the lesser the value, the lesser the alpha value, the more transparent it will be. And I found that 0.6 is the best transparency value. Alright, so now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be changing the positioning of this background, because at the moment this background is below the image and slide basically has this property called overflow hidden, so we can't even scroll down to see. Well, if we set this to scroll, we'll be able to scroll down and we'll see the background below, but we'll set it back to hidden since we don't want any overflown content to be shown at all. So right now we want this background to be part of the beginning of the slide. So we want it to be positioned in the slide element, which is the parent, which is its parent element. This parent element of Darker Slide is slide class, and we want it to be positioned so that as if it is the only element, as if there's no other element, as if there's no image element as well. So we want it to be where the image is currently positioned, basically. So we're going to be using this property called position absolute, which basically takes this element out of the document flow. So now that the image, now that the background is out of the document flow, so basically now what we want to do is we want it to be based on the slide, because right now at the moment it's as if the Darker Slide is not part of the slide class. So right now we want to ensure that it is part of the slide class, and its boundaries, its dimensions is based on the slide class, because at the moment, since we set position to absolute, it's as if the Darker Slide is not part of the slide class and it's just outside the document. So we want this to be part of the slide class, so we're going to be including a property in our slide class called position relative. So with that, it will cause the element to be based on an element, on the nearest element that has the position relative property, which is why we've added the position relative property in our slide class. So still we cannot see our Darker Slide, and that's because we also need to set the positioning, so where it should be positioned based on the slide class. So do we want it to be on top? Do we want it to be at the bottom, left or right? So we're going to be including another property called top 0. So now it is at the top of the slide class. If we were to remove position relative, it would just be on top because it is out of the document flow, basically. So it's just hanging out, it's just floating. But position absolute will cause the background to be based on the element, the nearest element with position relative, and all of these elements have the position relative property. So we've got to add it in our slide class, since we want the Darker Slide to be a part of the slide class. So now it's positioned on top of the slide class. Also, if we increase, the higher the value, the more further it will be from the top of the slide class. So for example, if we set it to 50 pixels, then it would be 50 pixels away from the top of the slide class. But we want it to be 0 pixels away from the top of the slide class. So we want it to be at the furthest top. And then we also want to ensure that it always starts from the left side. It is always positioned from the left side of the slide class and not just at the center or towards the right side. So we're also going to be including a property called left 0. So for example, once again, the higher the value, the more further it will be from the left side of the class, but we want it to be right at the left, right at the left side of the class. So we're going to set this 0 pixels, so 0 pixels away from the left. Then the last thing that we're going to add is we want to ensure that the width and height, basically the background takes up the full width and the full height of the element that has position relative, the nearest element with position relative, which is the slide class. So we're going to set the width and height to 100%, so it will take up the full width and the full height of the slide class because it has position relative. Alright, so now the next thing that we're going to be working on is our buttons, because we also want our buttons to be part of the slide class. Basically, we want it to be part of the image or in front of the image. We don't want it to be next to the image, but we want it to be a part of the image, or basically part of the slide class once again. Alright, so now we're going to select this button, and since it is a class, we're going to select it with a dot and then the name of the class, which is slide-button. Alright, so now first things first, we want to set the background to be transparent, as at the moment it is taking the default color, which is gray, light gray, so we'll set this to transparent. So now it is taking the color of the body, which is white. Another thing that are always in buttons by default is also the border. So we'll set the border to be 0, so there shouldn't be any border in our buttons. We want the button, also the SVG, to have a white color. So we're going to set the color to be white. So at the moment we can't see our arrow just yet because we want our arrow to be a part of the slide class element, and not, so it should appear around here where the slide class is, so around the image. Alright, so now we're going to be including the position absolute property once again, and because it will take up the element that the nearest element that has position relative, which is the slide class. So without if position relative was removed, then that means the button would just be somewhere random. It would not be part of the document, it would not be part of the slide class. But if we set the slide class with position relative, then the arrow will be part of the slide class, which it is now, and now it is towards the left side. However, right now we first want to set it below. We want it to be vertically towards the center, so we are going to be using top property, and basically we want it to be 50% away from the top area of the slide. So once again, the top property, the higher the value, the further away the element will be from the top. And right now we just want it to be 50% away from the top. So we'll set the value of the top property to 50%. So now it is 50% away from the top. So we don't need to get the exact pixel value, which makes life convenient. So now at the moment we can only see the next button, and the next button should be towards the right side, whereas the left button should be towards the left side. So we're going to be using z-index so that to ensure that all of our slide buttons are in front of the slide element. Alright, so now before we move the next button towards the right side of the slide element, we're first going to include some margin spacing. So we don't want it to have any top and bottom spacing, but we only want it to have left and right spacing. Each arrow should have a left and right spacing of 10 pixels. So now instead of going, top margin left 10 pixels and then margin right 10 pixels, we can encapsulate this in one line. So we just so we can add two values. The first value will basically define the top and right spacing, so it will add the top and right spacing to the element, to the slide button element, but we don't want any top and bottom spacing, so we'll set that to 0 pixels. But each arrow should have left and right spacing, and we want it to be of 10 pixels, so it will automatically add margin spacing towards the left and the right spacing, and in one line only. So now you can see it moved slightly. Alright, so now the last thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to select the next button so that we can move it towards the right side of the slide element. So in order to do that, we first have to select it with its unique identifier, which is its ID next button. We're going to select this, and because it is an ID, we'll select it with a hashtag, and basically we want to set the right positioning to 0%. Alright, so now we are going to be working on our slide content, all of our text, designing, and positioning. So first of all, you can see that in our document tree, our slide content is right after darker slide. So we're just going to select the slide content, and we're going to first create a comment so that we can separate the main slides classes and elements and the content and description. So now we're going to first select the slide content, and because it is a class, we'll select it with a dot and then the name of the slide of the class. And the first thing we want to do is we want to create a flexible layout. Reason being is because we want all of the elements in our slide content to be positioned towards the center of the slide element. So right now we're going to be using display flex to create a flexible layout. Next thing is we don't want the flex direction to be in a row, but we want it to be in a column. So the heading should be first, then the paragraph, and then the button. They should all be one above the others rather than next to each other. So we're going to set the flex direction to a column instead. Now in order to center all of this towards the center, we want to make sure that it takes up the full height of the slide. So we're going to set height to 100%. And now we're going to be using text align in order to align all of our text towards the center. So now that looks a little better. So now we want to position all of our elements towards the bottom to be vertically centered. So in order to achieve this, we're going to be using justify content in order to bring it down. And now we want to make sure that none of the content inside the slide content element overflows the class. And now instead of restricting the width, we're going to be including, in our HTML file, we're going to be including a breaker. So this will basically create a new line. So we're going to create a new line around here. So now there should be a new line after this text Pelentesc habitant. So now you can see that a new line has been created automatically. Now since the width will be changing from 100% to 0%, yes, overflow hidden will basically hide all of our content, but we also want to ensure that our text does not wrap up, does not break into new lines. So we're going to use this property called text wrap, and we want to set it to no wrap so it will not break into new lines. So when we click on next, we see that the first slide, which I included the breaker, the text does not break into new lines. If we remove this, or if we included the default value, which is wrap, you can see that all of our text will break into new lines, and that doesn't look nice. So we'll set it to no wrap. And now we want to include a little bit of spacing, because as you can see, the transition from one slide to the next, all of the text basically squeeze into the edge without the padding space. So when we reload our page, you can see that when we click on next, all of our text squeeze into the edge of the slider or the background, and that does not look nice. So we're going to include a little bit of spacing, but only inside spacing, but we only want to include spacing horizontally and not vertically. So we don't want top and bottom spacing, we only want left and right spacing. And we'll set this to 40 pixels. So there will be 40 pixels of padding spacing, or inner spacing, towards the left and the right side of the slide content. Alright, so now let's start with designing our text that is inside the slide content. So we're going to select the slide content once again, and then we are going to select the element that we want to create that is inside the slide content. And the first element that we're going to be working with is a heading 1. So the title will include simple properties. First things first, we want the color to be white. We want the font size to be really huge, so we'll set it at 65 pixels, and we want it to be nice and thick, but not too thick. The next element that we're going to be working with is the paragraph. So once again, we're going to use the parent element to select this paragraph, as this paragraph is inside the slide content. And once again, the color should be white, the font size should be at 16 pixels, the font weight should be around 500, so less thick than the heading. However, it feels a little too thick, and if we try to reduce the font weight to 400, it feels a little too thin. So we're going to use this new property that we haven't used yet called WebKit Font Smoothing, which basically smoothens the lining of text. So we will set it to anti-aliased. So now when we check our font again, it looks just right, because without the WebKit font smoothing property, it looks a little too thick. So WebKit fonting basically helps to smoothen and to basically decrease the intensity of the font. So now it looks just right. So usually WebKit font smoothing is perfect when you want something in between. Like for example, in our case, I wanted something in between 500 and 400, and WebKit fonting is the property that basically achieves this and gives us a font weight of 450 if that existed. Alright, and now the next thing that we're going to be working on is the button wrapper. Alright, so now we're going to be selecting our button wrapper, which holds our 2 buttons, and we're basically going to set the layout of our buttons so they should be in one line, and there should also be some spacing between the buttons and the text as well. So we're going to select the container that it is in, and then the name of the class that we want to modify. First of all, we want some margin top spacing of 40 pixels, so there will be spacing between the text and the buttons. And then another thing is we want to ensure that these buttons are always in one row rather than in a column, so we're going to set the flex direction to be in a row. Alright, so now we're going to be selecting our buttons, and we're going to be designing our buttons. So we're going to select these 2 buttons with the button wrapper class. So we're just going to select the button wrapper, and then select the element that we want to modify, which is the button itself. But we want these 2 buttons. We're going to set different colors for these 2 buttons, but they should have a few things in common, a few properties in common. So first of all, the padding space should be the same, and it should be 12 pixels tall. Basically, vertically, there should be 12 pixels of spacing top and right, and there should be 32 pixels of spacing horizontally, so towards the left and the right side, inside the left and the right side of the button. And then another thing is we want the border radius to also be the same, so the border radius affects how round the corners or the edges of the element is. So we're going to set it to 3 pixels, so not much. We're also going to change, we also want them to have the same font size of 15 pixels, the same font thickness of 500, and then we also want each of them to have a border, a white border and we want it to be a little thick, so we'll set it at 2 pixels, and we want the border to be solid, because if we set it to another value, for example dotted, then you would see our buttons would look dotted and sliced up, but we want it to be solid and straight, so we're going to set it to a solid value. Okay, so right now we can see that our buttons are towards the left side, so that means our slide content is still not yet towards the center horizontally, it's only vertically center. So we're going to scroll up and we're going to add one more property, which is place items, or even align items also work, and we're going to set the value to be center, so now our buttons should be centered. Alright, so now we're going to be working on the design of each button. So we're first going to select our first button, which is called button 1. So we're going to first select the parent element that this button is in, and then we're going to select the button that we want to modify, which is button 1. So first of all, this is the button towards the left side, and we want to create a spacing between these two buttons. So we'll create margin right spacing only of 20 pixels. So there should be 20 pixels outside this button, and it should create a 12 pixel difference between these two buttons, or 12 pixel space. Another thing is we want the color of our this button to be white. The background should be transparent, and also we're going to be adding a hovering effect, so when the mouse hovers around the button, it should change the color purple, and same thing for this button as well. So we want to create a transition, or basically a smooth transition from the background color, which is transparent, to purple. So now we want the color as well as the background to contain this transition, so we'll just set it so we don't need to specify what property needs to be transitioned, since we want these two properties to transition from the color white and the background to transition from the color transparent to the color purple. So we're just going to leave, or we're not going to specify what property needs to be alright, so now we're not going to specify what property needs to transition, because we want more than one property to be transitioned. From the color should have a transition, so should the background, so we're not going to specify the property. So the transition will occur in all properties of this element. Then we're going to specify how long this transition should be. So for example, from the color transparent to the color purple, it should take 0.2 seconds, and we want it both ways, when the mouse is hovering on the button and when the mouse exits the button. So we'll include ease in out. Now the next button that we have to work on is button 2. So once again, we're going to select the parent elements, and then the element that we want to specifically modify. So we want this to have a purple text, but then the background should be white, and the transition, once again, we want the transition to be for both these two properties. So I'm not going to specify which property needs to have this transition, because more than one property needs to transition, and we want this to take a little longer than button 1, so we're going to set it at 0.4 seconds, and we want it both ways, when the mouse is hovering on the button and when the mouse exits the button. And now finally, we're going to specify what properties are going to change when the mouse hovers around the button, and we want these two buttons to have the same color. We want them to be purple, to have the same color when it's being hovered on, so we want both of them to be purple and to have a white font color when they're being hovered on, when a mouse is hovering around these two buttons. So we're going to select these two buttons. Since they're going to have the same hovering properties, we're going to select this and then include the hover pseudo class, and then we're also going to select the second button, and we're going to include the hover pseudo class, so that the properties that we're going to add are going to occur when the button is hovering on these buttons. So first of all, we want the background to be purple, we want the font color to be white, and we want the border color to change to purple. So over here we set these two buttons to have a white border, but then during hover, the border color specifically, so it should still have the same thickness, it should still be solid, so we only want to change the border color, so it will change the border color from white to purple. So now when we hover around our mouse, we can see a nice transition. So now that looks much better. Now the last thing that we're going to be adding is the slider icons that will be on the bottom of the page to indicate what page or what slide the user is currently viewing. So we're going to scroll over to the bottom, and right after third slide, or the last slide, we're going to create a div, and we're going to assign this to a class, and we're just going to call it slider icons container. Now we're going to be including 3 icons, so we're going to store them in the form of a span, and each span will have the same class, slider icon, and the first icon will always be active, so we will include the active class by default, just like our first slide. The first slide is always going to be active, the first thing that the user sees, so we always set that to active. Same thing for the slider icons, the first icon will also always be active at first. Before we make changes in JavaScript. And then the other 2 are just going to have the slider icon class. So now when we check our page, we don't see it yet, and one thing is, because these icons are actually below all of our content, all of our images, they're all below, so we're also going to have to use position absolute in order to set them in front of the slide, and we're going to also have to use top and left property so that we can ensure that it is positioned towards the center of the page but on the bottom of the page. So we're going to head over to CSS in order to include these properties. So now over here we're just going to create a comment, and we're going to call it slider position icon, so it will indicate what position or what slide the user is currently viewing. And then we're going to select the container, the slider icons container. So we want these icons to be in one row rather than in a column, so we're going to use a flexible layout in order to achieve this. Set the flex direction to be in a row. So then now we're going to be using position absolute, just like we did for our arrow and for the dark slide background. We're going to be using for our slider icons container. And so now this element is now out of the document flow, but it will follow, or it will be based on an element that the nearest element that has position relative, which is the slide class, and that's where we want our slider container, that's where we want our icons to be. Alright, so now let's position these icons, and first of all, we can't see them yet, so we're going to use, because we haven't designed the span elements yet, so we're just going to use this border to indicate where it is so that we can see where we want it to be positioned. So first of all, we want the top property to be so if the top property is a high value, then that means the element will be positioned at the bottom. If it's at 0, or the less the value, the higher it will be, the more the value, the lower it will be. So we want it to be at around 93%. We don't want it to be at the bottom fully. If we want it to be at the bottom, we would set it to 100%, but we want there to be some spacing between the icons and the bottom of the page, and then we're going to include the left property so that we can position it towards the center, horizontally center of the slide. So we're going to set this value to 50%. So at the moment we can't see it very clearly, so we will set this to red so that it can be, because it's a little too dark, and we'll set this border to a high value. So now you can see the little icon here. So now let's get rid of the border and let's include the slider icons design, so they all have a class called slider icon. Alright, so we want all of these icons to have a white background, so we'll set the background to be white. We want to set the width and height to 10 pixels, so we don't want it to be too large. And we also want these icons to be round, so we're going to use the border radius property in order to achieve this. And in order to make a circle, we'll just set it to 50%. However, anything 50%, or if it's greater than 50%, will create a circular shape. And now the last thing that we're going to add is the transition property. So for example, from one slide icon will turn from white to purple. So for example, at the first slide, the first icon will be purple, and then when the user clicks on the next button, on the previous button, and the slide changes, the first icon will change from purple to white. So we want a color transition, so we're going to include a transition property, and we only want the transition to occur for the background color. So we're going to specify which property should have this transition. The width and height should not have a transition, and we want this transition to be in 0.4 seconds, and we also want it both ways, when the color turns from purple to white and from white to purple. Alright, so we don't see it yet. I just realized I made a little mistake. So the class is called slider icon. Alright, so now why can't I see it? Oh my gosh, this is so bad. So now when we check our page, we can see all 3 buttons. Now what is needed is some margin spacing between these icons, not top and bottom, just right and left spacing. So we want to select all of these icons now once again, and we want the spacing. We want to add margin right spacing, but we don't want to add margin right spacing towards all of these icons. We only want it to be in the first two. So the first icon should have margin right spacing to create the spacing between the first and second. The second should also have a margin right to create the spacing between the second and third, but the third does not need to have spacing, and if we do include spacing, the slider will not look like it's at the center. So that's why we're going to select the slider icon again, but this time we're going to add some pseudo classes. So first of all, we want these specific slider icons to have margin right spacing of 6 pixels, but we want to specify which slider icons should have this margin spacing, or which should not have this this margin spacing, or this property basically. So we're going to include a pseudo class called not, and then specifically we want the slider icon that is the last element, or basically the last child, not to have this margin right spacing. So all the other slider icons should have this property except the last child. So we're going to specify the elements that should not have this spacing, which is the last child. Alright, so now the last thing that we're going to do is to specify the color, the active property. So once again, we're going to select the slider icon class, and then the slider icon that is active should have a purple background. So now that looks better. However, when we transition from one slide to the next, we see that our slider icons do not change. So we're going to be using JavaScript in order to update this change. Alright, so now let's head over to our script tag, and right at the top we're going to add another constant, and basically this constant will store all of these slider icons. So we're going to create a constant called slider icons, and then we're going to ask the document, and we want the document to look for all the classes. So we're going to use query selector all the classes that have the class that have the name slider icon. And then what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our update slider. So this function is responsible for adding and removing the active class, and that's what we want to do. The only thing we're doing with our slider icons is removing and adding the active class based on the slide's position that the user is currently being displayed. So now this time we're going to include the constant slider icons. Basically, we want to get the old position. So in our case, at the moment, slider 1 has the active class, so we want to get that element, and then we're going to access the classes of that element, and we want to remove the active class from the icon that currently has the active class, and then we want to change, and we want to add the active class to a new icon, to the next icon that should be presented. So we're going to once again call the slider icons constant, and now we want to access the new position, the new slide that is currently being displayed, and then we want to get the slide's position so that the slider's icon can also be activated. So now we're going to access its class list and then add the active class to that slider icon. So now when we check our page and when we click next, we can see a nice transition that we created with CSS, and we can see that the second icon is highlighted, showing that we're at the second slide, and then the third slide, and when we click next we go back to the first slide, and also when we go back to slide 3, slide 2, slide 1. So it creates a beautiful presentation. So now what we want to do is we want to make a more efficient code, because this is just a repetition. Two classes have active class being removed, two elements have active classes being added. So we can create this, we can remove these active classes from these elements in one line. So first of all, we're going to create an array, and this array will include these two elements. So we're going to select this element, paste it here. So that's the first element of the array. This is the second element of the array, and then we're going to create a one line for each loop. So we're going to include the for each method. So then the for each loop will iterate through these two elements, and then we're going to create a variable that will basically represent the current elements that the loop is currently processing, that the loop is currently working on. So something simple such as L standing for element, and then we're going to create an R function. So whatever variable is being processed is represented as L standing for element, and now when this element is currently being processed, we want this element to have to first of all remove the active class, because this is the old position, so we want the active class to be removed from the current element that is being processed. So now we can remove these two lines, and now we can add another line for adding the active classes, which is going to change the position, because now this is the new position, so the new position should have the active class added to it. So now our code looks less repeated. So now when we reload our page and we check our page, we can see that the slides move as it should. So does the slider icons. It moves as it should. Thank you so much for watching this video. Click on Code Harvest to watch more beginner-friendly, in-depth videos and subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. See you in the next video. Goodbye!